The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore, written by Evan Friss, published in August of 2024 by Viking Publishing, with a snippet read by Richard Coombs. Available for checkout right now at the Alice L. Pendleton Library. When we think of a bookstore, we tend to imagine rows of books, neatly arranged titles standing in the window, and quiet browsing. It's fair to say that Benjamin Franklin's bookshop wasn't anything of the sort. Inside his teeming brick building were hulking wood-framed printing presses, fat kegs of ink, cases of type — he used Caslin but preferred Baskerville — reams of paper, pages dangling from the ceiling to dry, and heaps of rags. Philadelphians came to check their mail. Boys carried off stacks of newspapers. Franklin's shop wasn't called Benjamin Franklin's Bookstore, Ben's Books, or Franklin's Fine Finds. In fact, the word bookstore didn't yet exist. The concept of a bookstore, a retail outlet selling primarily books, was still embryonic. Yet Franklin was definitely a bookseller. Teachers bought school books from him. Ministers picked up religious texts. Almost everyone wanted his famous almanac. He sent Homeric poetry, political tracts, and books and pamphlets on a mind-boggling range of subjects to colonial outposts near and far. His job was never singular or boring. He was a shopkeeper who sold books, retail and wholesale, a printer and sometimes binder, an editor and sometimes author, a marketer, a publisher, and a postmaster, roles that blurred. Charming, industrious, and a writer himself, Franklin was undoubtedly well suited to the job, especially compared with the other founding fathers. Adams was too prickly, Washington too regal, Hamilton too antagonistic, Jefferson too profligate, and Madison too awkward. While Franklin is most famous for his role as a statesman, diplomat, and inventor, his experience in the book trade was a formative one. For the rest of his life, he self-identified as a printer. He understood that we are what we read, and that what we read is dictated by what authors choose to write, what publishers choose to publish, what printers choose to print, and what, where, and how booksellers choose to sell. Franklin lived for the better part of the 18th century. Over the course of his life, colonists became more literate, more cultured, and ultimately, more American. Books were partly responsible. And so was Benjamin Franklin. All the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out on books, Franklin wrote of his childhood fondness for reading. Indeed, young Ben was a bookish boy. He zoomed past his peers in school, and his father thought he was destined for the ministry. That was because Josiah didn't know his children very well, especially his 15th. Franklin, born in 1706, was bright, but he was equally unorthodox, skeptical, and cheeky. Josiah eventually gave up on his dream of college for his son, as it was too expensive, and instead turned his attention to finding him a trade. By the age of 10, Franklin was working in the family business. He was miserable. He had no interest in a life of making soap. At 12, he began working for his older brother James, a printer with an office a few blocks from their modest Boston home. Franklin signed a 9-year indenture, legally binding him to James and forbidding him from marrying, gambling, or haunting alehouses. Not that any of this bothered the boy. He mostly wanted to read. John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress and Plutarch's Lives were his favorite. The brothers Franklin operated at the center of the colonial book imprinting universe. Founded in 1620, the Boston that Franklin walked was home to just 10,000 people, all living and working near the rocky harbor. Though tiny and provincial by European standards, Boston was the heart of British America. The first printer in the area set up shop in 1638 in Cambridge, just across the Charles River. Its business was entwined with a 2-year-old college, America's first. Harvard's students, faculty, and library made for good customers. New York, the future capital of publishing, didn't have a single printer until 1694. That young Franklin even had access to books was unusual. According to late 17th century probate inventories, 65% of colonial households were bookless. The others usually had just a single volume or two, typically the Bible. More robust collections included plays, poetry, and sometimes pornography. Generally, though, the book market was narrow and focused on godliness and orthodoxy, just as government and religious leaders wished. Consequently, the earliest printers, James Franklin included, churned out sermons and psalm books, in addition to legislative proceedings, forms, broadsides, and newspapers. Seldom did they print books as we know them. Most of the books that did circulate came from Europe, imported by the well-connected via agents in London. There were a few booksellers, also clustered in Boston, who bought from the Old World to sell in the New. The first was Hezekiah Usher. His friends called him Hez.